Barrett and Dr. Niamh Feely with us today, who are giving the workshop on feedback and debriefing. So Dr. Aileen Barrett is the Editor-in-Chief of the Clinical Teacher Journal and also holds a PhD in medical education from UCC and has a special interest in feedback, developing faculty and workplace assessments. We also have Dr. Niamh Feely, who's a consultant anaesthetist in University Hospital Kerry, and she has been a senior clinical lead for simulation for the NHS South Central and Director of Simulation at Heatherwood and Wexham Park Hospitals, and was also Chair of the UK's Intensive Care Society Clinical Simulation Working Group, and also has a special interest in in-situ simulation, faculty development, and simulation design and quality feedback. So I'll hand over to yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. We're delighted that we're able to spend a bit of time with you all today. Aileen is going to be driving all of our slides. We'll hopefully keep the slides content to a minimum. This will be much more about conversation. But we really feel that getting now to the point of talking about debrief will link everything that you've had in all of the other workshops together. So Aileen, I'll hand over to you to get things started.
Great morning, everyone, and to everyone who's going to watch this later. I hope, as Niamh said, that this is going to start to bring together all the ideas that you've generated through the workshops, and I had a chance to look at some of them during the week as well, and particularly tried to align what we're saying with very much obviously with Dr. Manny's work on learning outcomes, and then with Dave's work on actually developing your specific scenario, just developing your scripts for that as well. And now we're coming to the other side where you actually see how are we going to embed that learning for that simulation scenario as well, and for that team. So today, I suppose what we want is to really give you a guide to how to develop that debrief strategy. And that needs a little bit of thinking through. It's not just a case of feedback as you know it in terms of what we think about with workplace-based assessment. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences and I suppose the particular intent of debrief in the context of simulation as well. So that hopefully by the end of today, and by the time you get to watch this, you'll be able to really define the purpose and the scope of your simulation debrief. And that's really important because you have a certain amount of time in these learning settings and you want to maximize those. So the conversation that you have in the debrief and the structure of that is actually really important to make sure it aligns with those learning outcomes. Hopefully then you'll be able to choose by the end of today and integrate a recognized debrief strategy. There is a huge amount of work being published in this area, but some really nice distinct models. And Dr. Feely and I have really chatted through kind of a few. We just picked out a few today to get you started. And I've put in lots of references that you can look at this in another time as well. But it's really important that you choose one that really maps to what your intention is for the scenarios and for your simulations, and pick one and work with it. And Dr. Feely is going to talk a little bit more about her experience then in how you actually blend that into ongoing simulation strategies then as well. And then we'll think a little bit at the end about the evaluation approach. And I know Dave covered some of this as well over the last two workshops, but really again, it's to try and keep linking things all the time to those initial learning outcomes. And as Dr. Manny said, making sure those learning outcomes are mapped to, in the context of undergraduate education, to their curriculum, in postgraduate training, in your healthcare teams, that it's aligned to a certain learning strategy as well. So that's our plan. If you think of anything else that you would like to add or to ask questions about, do that as we go along. I can't see the chat box just when I'm sharing my screen, but I think Dr. Feely can, so we'll moderate that and you can give me a nod then as well if you see any things in the chat box. And just, there's only 4 of you actually on the, 4 or 5 of you on the screen. So if you want to just dip in and out just to ask questions as well. So we sent on a template and Dr. Cook or Prof Cook sent that on to you. Now, we didn't actually mean for you to have to fill it in before the workshop. My whole idea behind this was this is probably the only hour you're going to get today to actually have to yourselves to think about your scenarios. So I thought let's make the most of that and let's get you starting to bring this submission together for the competition. So take a minute while you're listening and while you have that template in front of you, hopefully as well, to think about, at the moment, as a team, what have you come up with as your aim and your learning outcomes? And have you written those down? And if not, now is a good time to just jot them down, bullet points and think about what it is that you're trying to get out of this. And later on, when you go back to padding this out for your actual submission, also think about the educational factors influencing your choice of simulation scenario. So in the context of, say, communication in healthcare teams, I happen to know just one of the researchers in that area. Her name's Lorelei Lingard. She does a huge amount of work on that. So they've identified where there are gaps in communication skills among and between healthcare teams that contribute to things like error, to things like, you know, other issues within quality and safety. So you have all these educational principles and educational theory that actually then become translated into practical teaching as priorities. So think about where yours is mapped into that as well. So with your learning outcomes, how did you actually come around those, and why is this something you need to address? And that's your aim. And then obviously now you've thought a little bit about your content. I think these are all in situ simulations from what I remember. Is that right, Emily, for the competition? And how you're going to set that up. And Dave has talked you through a whole template of what you need for that as well. So if you've written those down, now what we want to think about is the debrief. And just generally speaking, have any of you thought about that yet? Have any of you ever been involved in a simulation debrief? No? Either as a learner or a facilitator? No? Okay. So Dr. Feely is going to talk a little bit more about her experience doing that as well. But it is not an insignificant, I think, experience the first time. I've only been involved in one simulation, and that was just looking at how it was actually conducted. And it was a couple of years ago. It was in Montreal. So the challenge for me was that everyone went between French and English, like literally mid-sentence, in the middle of this emergency room scenario, which was so lifelike. It was absolute high fidelity. And even I could feel on the outside, there is an intensity to that as well. So particularly the first time you have a group in the simulation setting, just remembering that this is new a lot of the time for everybody. So the first one is a little bit of bedding in, and that's why having as much detail and as much preparation as possible, and that's key to your competition submissions as well, is that design and having thought through all those ifs, buts and ands for that simulation as well. So in terms of the debrief then, and the strategy for debrief, there is so much literature on this, and I've given you some references on that template, and I added a few more this morning that I'll send on. But there's absolute agreement on the importance that if you were to set up just a simulation and no debrief, there would actually be little to no learning impact on that as well. The real importance of the debrief is not just in letting people identify their own learning needs, skills gaps, but actually as a team working together. So if you have lots of individuals who are really competent, highly skilled at their job, does that necessarily translate into good team performance? And what we know is that unless there's really effective communication between all those individuals, that healthcare team cannot function as well. So there is importance on the debrief. There are multiple models, and we've just picked 3 out of, I have no idea even how many there are at this stage, but we've picked 3 that have been really research informed, that have been really underpinned by pedagogical and educational principles, and that really actually bring together a how-to design that you can implement into your simulation strategy. But I would say that when you're choosing, so we've chosen 3 that we just thought are kind of very user-friendly. Context is everything. So make sure you choose your debrief strategy wisely, not just in terms of it matching what you want to achieve in terms of learning outcomes for your simulation scenario, but actually also in terms of your facilitator who's going to do this, their skill level, their comfort level with asking these types of questions, and their comfort with managing this situation. So there may be a faculty development piece in the future, obviously, that you would think about for other scenarios as well. So why debrief? This is the nuts and bolts of it then. Obviously, that's the essential component of the experiential learning. So we talk about all the time about deliberate practice, say, in skills training. And unless we have the feedback to go with that, just doing something 100 times doesn't make you an expert at it if the 100 times you've been doing it have all been incorrect. You need the feedback very early on to identify any need for change, and that deliberate practice then has to be constantly reviewed to ensure that it's still up to that level as well. And it's the same with any kind of simulation scenario. You need to have the debrief, or else everybody doesn't know what worked well or what didn't work well within that setting. And did the patient, the simulated patient in this setting, actually achieve the best possible care within this team? Essentially, debrief, and you know, I think we put the word debrief and feedback in the title because I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences and similarities, but I think debrief has really come to mean it's a real facilitated reflection on action, or inaction if you do it within event debriefing, and Dr. Feely is going to talk about that. But in terms of the reflection on what just happened in that simulation, it's a real skill to facilitate that conversation without actually giving any information, and to facilitate the team learning and the team thinking out loud and coming around to what worked well and what needs to change for the next time as well. And the role of the facilitator is to guide that using critical questions, but to support learners in identifying their own performance positives and areas for development. Now, I talk about this a lot in terms of feedback as well. The one thing we don't do in health professions education very well is affirm good practice. That's an international phenomenon. We've been talking about it for years in terms of feedback in health professions education. What we always forget when we give feedback, you know, in a workplace-based assessment or whatever it might be, we do always forget sometimes to, a lot of the time, to say, actually, that piece worked really well and what you did in that situation was really good. We tend to focus on what we need to change all the time. It's really important that we have that affirmation process as well. And the whole idea of that facilitated reflection in a debrief is that we're able to actually identify those positives as well as focusing on what needs to change for the next time. So what do you think are the differences? And I'm going to turn off the screen though, so maybe I can see the chat box for a second. What do you think are the differences between feedback and debrief? Can you think of anything? You all are most of you online trainees? So in your setting, you probably get feedback all the time. Are you invited to give feedback much? Probably not too often. It's a real challenge, isn't it? But you feel like do you get feedback? Anyone want to pop anything in the chat box, even if you don't want to talk to me? No? Okay, can everyone still hear me actually? Emily, can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you anyway.
Okay, great. Oh, somebody did put something in the chat box. Thank you. Debrief, oh, great, I can see the chat now. Okay, so debrief is more about a two-way discussion, exactly. So it's a real learning conversation, facilitated by somebody who really guides you in thinking out loud. And as you've said that there, Kevin, I think you're right. What happens in reality is feedback is probably a one-way conversation a lot of the time, unfortunately. What we would like to see is feedback being much more learner-centered and therefore being much more of a two-way conversation. And again, facilitating that think out loud in terms of, say, clinical reasoning, problem solving, identifying priorities for treatment or management or whatever it might be as well. But in practice, I think we do see a lot of the time that people give feedback, somebody accepts it, and off they go. Ideally, it would be a lot more two-way, but debrief is definitely a very specific way in which to guide a team to think critically and think out loud about team-based performance as well. So thank you for that. Let me pop back in the share here. Okay, let's see. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Feely now, and we'll talk then a little bit about how you're actually going to go about this.
Okay, thanks, Aileen. So what I'd really like you guys to do now is to think about your own scenarios as we work through this slide and the next couple of slides. Think about your own storyboards and the learning outcomes. And based on that, there are really a few questions that you're going to need to answer in setting up your debrief. First of all, you've got to think about who is going to lead this debriefing or learning conversation. It's likely that most scenarios will have more than one faculty member participating. So who is it who's going to take on that role in leading it? How are you going to decide who will actually do that? You know, if any of you have thought about it already, feel free to start jotting down some messages to me in the chat box. I have it open so I can see anything that you send through. But if you haven't thought about it, think about how you're going to decide who that will be. So you may have one person leading the conversation, but you also have to think then about who is going to participate in the learning conversation. So let me give you two quite different examples of learning events. Let's go back to the classical ACLS or ATLS type of scenarios or moulage, where somebody will be called to lead the scenario and they will be given some feedback or enter into a debriefing conversation with the faculty member. And traditionally, the vast bulk of that conversation has focused on the individual person who was leading the scenario. But I don't think that that's a very good model for broader simulation, where you actually want your entire group of learners to take as much as possible away from the session. You really want to make sure that in structuring your debriefing conversation, you're giving room for everybody who took part in the simulation to participate in the conversation and therefore to learn from that conversation. And this really is, as Aileen has already mentioned, this really is where the learning in simulation takes place. Simple, deliberate, repetitive practice has its limits. The reflection and the conversation that follow is really where things are embedded. So make sure that you are opening up the conversation to everybody who is there. So that's kind of in your planning phase. You're going to be thinking about how to do this, how to draw people in. And then where are you going to do it? So in big simulation centers with the luxury of a completely separate debriefing room, it's very nice to be able to stop the scenario, move people away from that scenario environment, give them a little bit of time to decompress their headspace, get them to somewhere a bit more neutral, and then launch into a conversation. But if you guys are doing in situ work, that might be a bit more of a challenge. Are many of you doing in situ? I think quite a few are. Would that be correct? Anyone going to pop anything in the chat? So if you're doing it in situ, finding somewhere to do the debriefing conversation can be a challenge. We used to admit SimMan to one of our intensive care beds in the trust I worked in England every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. And we were very lucky because immediately adjacent, we had a very nice seminar room. So we could take our small group of learners into that room immediately the simulation was finished. When we ran pediatric in situ simulations, it was a little bit more of a challenge. We would take a little bit of and there's a lot of background noise there. If anyone is not on mute, can they go on mute, please? Thanks. So, if, Aileen, are you able to mute everyone? Okay, so no, if you just go back up 2 slides again, yeah, stick with that slide there. Okay, so when we did our pediatric in situ simulations, we were able to take one of the single rooms on the pediatric ward. And actually, all that we did then was threw a sheet over whatever equipment we were using and stayed in that individual room. We wanted to make sure that people were moved away from the simulation equipment and environment before we commence the conversation. So you'll have to give some consideration to that. Do you have a separate venue, or do you need to adapt the space in which the simulation itself is taking place? When we've run them in theatre, we've then retreated to the anaesthetic room, for example. So we have that little bit of distance between the action and the conversation. The third question that I suggest that you think about is when you're actually going to deliver particular parts of debriefing conversations. There may be a role for doing some work during the scenario, but the vast bulk of the conversation will end up taking place afterwards. I haven't watched the second of Dave's videos yet, looking at how to conduct the scenario. Did he talk at all about stopping a scenario partway through and how you might deal with that and how you might build in a bit of a conversation at that stage? Can anyone who was on that type in a message and let me know? Emily, are you still there? Do you know if that was covered?
I actually wasn't there myself, and I haven't had a chance to watch it back, so I'm not sure.
So let's think about it. So if you've got somebody who goes completely off track, one of the ones that I often had was the patient with asthma, and the asthma isn't diagnosed, isn't treated properly. The patient's progressing towards having a silent chest, and the people involved in the scenario get distracted by this silence of the chest, and they think, oh my goodness, there must be a pneumothorax. I've got to decompress attention pneumothorax. So you might choose to pause the scenario at that stage, get everybody out of role, and start a short conversation during which you might review what has led us to the point of the diagnosis of tension pneumothorax when actually there wasn't one. And after talking things through and reaffirming the key signs of asthma, reaffirming the clinical progress, you might then be able to say, okay, let's recommence. Let's have the scenario work through to a natural conclusion again. So it is possible to deliberately pause that scenario partway through. Personally, I think that's a bit more challenging than waiting until the end. But if your learners have gone completely off script, then you may have no choice. Because remember that you come to a scenario with very specific aims and learning objectives that are linked potentially to a curriculum or to somebody's progression through grades of employment or to preparation for exams. And so there are very, very clear criteria that you must meet. And if the major learning takes place in the debriefing conversation, you have to make sure that that conversation links to those learning outcomes and not to whatever tangent the people have gone off on. So think carefully about how you might manage that. You don't want the final conversation to be off on a tangent. Also have a think about whether you might give any individual feedback to people. You know, again, to go back to that ACLS type of approach, where it's very much, you did this well, but here are the things you were completely rubbish at, and here's what you need to improve for next time. It's preparing you for a summative assessment as an individual. A broader simulation learning experience isn't about that. This is about your teams learning together in the workplace to improve patient safety, to improve clinical care. But if you happen to notice anything clinically that may be a cause for concern, I think you have an ethical duty to find a way to bring that up, perhaps in private, with the individuals involved. So give some thought to how you might set up any individual feedback if you did have particular clinical concerns. How would you make contact with that person? Where and when would you deliver that constructive feedback to them to help them to improve? Again, designing your debrief, what are you going to focus on? Align it with your learning outcomes. And the how will be based on a debrief model, and Aileen will go through that with you in a few minutes. So they're the questions I really want you to focus on as you design your debrief. Make sure you've considered all of these points. And then you can start to really get into the debrief essentials. Aileen, can you go to the next slide, please? The essentials of how you are actually going to conduct this debriefing conversation once you've given thought to those few questions. The first and most important thing that you have to do is make sure that your learners understand that this is a safe space. It's hugely important that you set up that psychological safety for all of the learners before you commence. It's important that you set up your debriefing stance. You know, this is the basic assumption of how we are going to work through some learning together. You'll need to establish some rules with your participants for how this debriefing conversation is going to work. So what are those rules going to be? And think about simulations that you've been involved in. Think about the ones where psychological safety has been set very well, where the rules of how this is going to work have been described very effectively. Your participants need to know what's coming. And if you do all of that, then you will establish a shared mental model of what the conversation will be about. Remember that everything that you want to focus on has got to link back somehow to those key learning objectives. And certainly something that I do is that I keep the learning objectives at the top of the page in front of me. So when I'm making notes as I go through the scenario, thinking about what will be included in my debriefing conversation, I have those learning objectives in front of me so that everything can be linked back to them. In a moment, we'll have a look at the open-ended questions. I think this probably is for people in the healthcare industry is one of the biggest challenges, to ask people open-ended questions and not to simply give them our opinions or our perspective on what has worked and where the problems were. And when you ask those open-ended questions, just don't be afraid to use silence. Give people time. You're asking your learners to open up and reflect on something that may actually have been quite difficult for them. And you need to give them time to pluck up the courage to come out with their comments and their thoughts, as much as you need to give them time to formulate those thoughts. So don't be afraid of silence. When I became an ALS instructor, one of the keys that we were taught was that when you ask a question, count to at least 8 in your head before you decide that there are no answers coming. So make use of that silence to give people time for reflection. And if the silence persists, obviously then it falls back to you to come up with an alternative open question for your learners. The most important point to me on this slide is the psychological safety. I can't overemphasize it. I've been involved in many simulations, many multi-professional simulations, where I've had people of various different grades and professions working through scenarios that were built on critical incidents. So pediatric critical incidents and near misses. And people may be dealing with clinical scenarios that traumatize them. They may feel that they're opening themselves up to ridicule, that they're opening themselves up to a loss of standing if they open up truthfully in the debriefing conversation. So setting your psychological safety standards and your rules at the very outset can't be overemphasized. It's the absolute key. Okay, can we move on to the next one, Aileen, please? So to go back to these open-ended questions, people very often, they will, if you ask them, okay, so how did that go, or what happened, or the typical what did you do well, they will give you a list of observations. I did this, I did that, I did the other, or the patient was like this, then they were like that, then they progressed in whatever manner. But that's simply repeating a list of clinical observations. And what you actually want your learners to do during a debriefing conversation is to begin to analyze things in more depth. And that analysis may well go on for days or for weeks in their heads, particularly those slow burn type of people who take many days to internalize everything that they've experienced. So give them really, really open questions, such as those that are listed here on the screen. So what happened during that scenario? And allow them to talk it through. That's a little bit observational, isn't it? Well, this happened, that happened, the other happened. Okay, why did those things happen? What do you think? Why do you think those things happened? So going back to the asthmatic patient, well, I think they deteriorated because of X, Y, and Z. All right, what were you thinking when the patient deteriorated? And how did you feel? And if you're asking that, how did you feel? You're likely to be talking to one individual in the group. But remember again that this debriefing conversation is for every participant. So open the questions out. So how did that make everybody else feel? The person who was treating the patient was very anxious. They worried that they had missed something. How did you all feel when the patient deteriorated? What was going through your minds? How did it affect you? And wait for their thoughts, wait for their suggestions. They're the ones doing the learning. Move the questions on further. How can we move it forward as a team? What will we need to change, or what do we need to learn in order to make this change happen and embed it in our practice? So one of the first simulations that was done in the Royal Marsden Intensive Care Unit in London was the trachea in trouble scenario. A patient had recently had a tracheostomy. They were being turned in the bed. They began to deteriorate, to desaturate. There were difficulties with ventilation. The nurses at the bedside called in the senior nurse. They called in the doctors who were covering the unit. They worked through this scenario to try to come to a resolution and to save this patient from imminent death. And at the very end, the biggest learning that they took out of that was that they needed to change the setup of their bed space. They realized, what will we need to change? Well, we need to change things to make sure an anaesthetist can get around to the head end of the bed to be able to manage the patient's airway. And that caused us an awful lot of hassle, and it increased the stress levels, and it made it all very fraught. So what do we need to do to get them in there? Okay, we need to redesign where we store everything around the bed so that there is freedom of movement to the head of the bed again. Something that was very simple, but learning that came from the group of learners, and learning that made a real difference, potentially to patient safety, but a huge difference to them as individuals, feeling that they had control to develop things for the better. So there was a huge benefit to that seemingly very, very simple intervention. Can you go on to the next one? Yeah, thanks, Aileen. So sticking with these questions for a minute, I actually, in any of the faculty development sessions that are on in England, and indeed for myself, I put together a list, and here's some examples taken from Murphy's paper. I try to make sure that the language I use in the debriefing conversation is as conducive to learning as possible. In healthcare, we tend to talk about hard skills and soft skills. And soft, it's quite a pejorative term sometimes, isn't it? When we're talking about non-technical skills, it kind of implies they're not as important as the hard technical skills that we're all trained to be so good at. But the communication, the team working, those non-technical elements are sometimes the most important things. So think about the choice of language around those. In the debriefing conversation, this is about your learners coming up with the answers. So we might say, I think, or I feel, or I suggest, or I recommend. What's your alternative? How do you turn it back to them and make sure that it's more about what do you think? What do you feel? We have a tendency, coming from the type of feedback systems that we've grown up in, to say you need to do this or you should do that. Again, what are our alternatives to bring people to learning suggestions themselves, rather than simply being told by you? If the learning comes from within them, it will be much more effective. So think about the words that you use. Think about what you're really putting into that conversation, and come up with alternative phrases. The other thing that I've done for myself is I've made a little list of those opening phrases or opening questions. Because certainly when I started simulation, those type of open discussions did not come naturally to me at all. I really found it very, very difficult. And I made out several lists. And for the first few months of simulations, I would bring that list with me. I laminated it and I brought it with me so that I had something to refer to when I was trying to think, I'm going to break the silence now and I'm struggling to find the next phrase that I will use. So work your language out in advance. Okay. So that's enough for me from me for now, talking about words that we use. How do we decide on how we use those words effectively? Aileen's going to talk you through some of the models that bring a bit more structure to those concepts that I've just talked about.
And that's the thing, it's about moving it on now from your competition perspectives so that you can have an actual model, a defined model as part of your scenario. So I've picked, both of us have picked 3, and these are the research informed ones. But as I said, Dr. Feely is going to talk at the end a little bit more about how she in practice would blend them. But just again, think about at the beginning, find a model, that works for you and stick with it until you're comfortable with it as well. And I'll show you through 3 of them. And this one, the Diamond Debrief, is quite a nice structure because it's got a really nice graphic in the paper that, again, as Dr. Feely said, you could actually cut out and stick on the clipboard or whatever you have in front of you for a debrief if you're the person facilitating it. That's a really nice reminder of the structure. The Pearls, similarly, it's got a really nice structure. Again, you'd want to think through the script and the questions that you're going to use. And then the Team Gains is a little bit more involved and focuses a little bit more on the team dynamics as opposed to individual behaviors within the team and within the simulation setting. But again, it involves a little more depth in terms of facilitator skill in using critical questions. This is the Diamond Debrief. Now, when you look at the paper, it's from the clinical teacher in 2016. They have 2 sides to the Diamond. So this side is the how-to guide, and the other side is the actual theory informing, or the underpinning questions informing the Diamond design as well. So this model, even if you remember the 3 phases, these are the 3 critical phases, no matter what way you design your debrief and no matter what model you use. These are sort of the core elements of any debrief, is moving from description, expanding it out to analysis, and bringing it back to, so what now? What are we going to do next? What are we going to do well the same way the next time? And what are we going to change to improve it? And having those really defined outcomes. And the Trachea in Trouble is such a fabulous example of how simulation, and you put people who are doing this every day, but you put them into this defined simulation setting, create this scenario, and actually that allowed them to come up with such a critical change and improvement to how they were functioning as a team by just moving a bed position and making sure that everyone could access what they needed to do in order to get the better outcome for that patient as well. So with the description questions, this is where we're now starting to bring together what we've just talked about in terms of language, open-ended questions, the skill, and not saying, well, this is what I saw happen. You're actually asking the team as they were in it, what they saw from their perspectives. So what happened next, keep going, and then what happened, and see what everybody else saw. What were their perspectives on? Everyone sees things slightly differently. How did they see the scenario building up? And then there's the transition couple of phrases. And as Dr. Feely said, having those phrases that bring you through the transition if you're the person facilitating this. So let's go back to why we designed this scenario. This is what it was designed to do. So now think about, did the protocol work in this situation? How do we deal with this normally in this clinical situation? And is everyone okay with that? Then you get into your analysis phase. How did it make you feel? Why? How did it make others feel? Why was this an issue? Why was that an issue for others? Did you see somebody else's reaction to this? What do you think the patient's reaction to this was in a simulated setting or whatever? And then you transition back to the application piece as well. Again, wrap up the analysis, try and summarize that maybe slightly and what we've agreed we could do. And now, how could we bring this into a real life situation as well? So as an outsider in simulation, this one appeals to me because it's so practical and it's a real guide. I think particularly getting started, that would be a really nice model to have as an attachment on your competitions submissions. The Pearls as well is nice and easy to remember, and Walter Epic has been writing about simulation for quite a long time. I would say in terms of your competition design as well, do make sure you're familiar with the literature and the really up-to-date literature, around simulation and effectiveness of simulation, and also, kind of the trends in terms of particularly communication skills, the in-situ communication skills simulations as well, which, are quite challenging to do, but there's a huge amount of work going on in the areas as well. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a huge amount out there for you to take, change, adapt, and make sure it's placed within your context as well. So a lot of key people writing about it for years, like Deborah Nostell, Walter Epic, Adam Cheng is doing a lot of work, Jerry Gormley's done a lot of work around communication skills, around language and that as well. And they're, again, as somebody who's not involved in simulation, I could pick you out the key people who are presenting their work about this around the world as well. The Pearls then is promoting excellence and reflective learning in simulation. So the Pearls, none like, other mnemonics or acronyms, it doesn't actually stand for what you're going to do in the steps, but it's just a way of thinking about that. It's about reflective learning in simulation. But in particular, they're the ones who suggest that debrief script for all the reasons Dr. Feely just spoke about as well. In this one, then you've the more 4 phases where actually you bring it back first of all to their reaction level. Again, what happened? Why did it happen? What did you feel about that? What did you think was going on there? Did that make you think what you were, did that make you change what you were thinking? Why did you move in this direction? Why did you choose to do whatever it might have been? Then into the description, analysis, and then the summary section there as well. Now, again, I would think for any debrief situation that there would be a sort of a no-brainer that this always includes the learner take-home message. So again, as the facilitator, facilitating the debrief, instead of you wrapping it up with a take-home, and I say this all the time in any feedback context, that actually you want the learners to do that little wrap-up at the end. So what are the key messages or changes that we're going to take away from this as a team? And if you can get the learner to do that, that really reinforces the whole learning event excuse me, the whole learning event that has just happened then. And that's how they consolidate that piece then and make it into some tangible further step or whatever it might be as well. The team gains, as I said, is a little bit more, not that it's more complex, it just, again, takes into account a lot more around team dynamics. I would think, just from what I've been reading about it, probably a little more focused on established healthcare teams, in even the one Dr. Feely described there about the Trachea in trouble, as opposed to it being, say, from an undergraduate perspective as well, but no less usable in certain contexts as well. Again, reaction level to begin with, then thinking a little bit more about the clinical component, I guess, the zone in there. So might maybe be about more technical, even though we're trying not to use those words as such, but maybe about more the technical skill of a certain simulation as well. But then more discussion around how that might transfer to a real life situation. And then again, around the behavioral skills within the team. So a little bit more complex to facilitate in a very safe way, given all we've talked about around psychological safety as well. But summarizing again, and then the added piece that I suppose we're suggesting that, you know, everyone would think about in some context is the supervised practice of clinical skills where required. So especially maybe at an undergraduate level, if you are finding that particular members of that learning team for that day could do with some additional focused individual feedback and maybe a needs assessment in terms of future learning, future skill development, further practice that particular skill, whatever it might be, and that would be done maybe outside of the simulation setting then as well. So as I say, they're just 3 models. There's lots written on them. I've given you the references to the most recent papers about those in terms of how they've been evaluated, because they'll give you ideas as well for how you're going to evaluate your particular simulation scenario as well. So I'm going to hand you back to Dr. Feely just to now again, think again now about your notes on your template.
So think about those notes on your template. Think about those 5 questions that you ask when you're trying to design the debrief. And with those 5 questions in mind, you can now start to look at which of those models might give you the best fit. And actually, the diamond and pearls are very, very similar. You know, arbitrarily divided into 3 phases or 4 phases, but they're there to really achieve the same end. And as Aileen has said, the team gains is very good for the fine-tuning of the high-performing team. So the work that we do in Scotland with the National ECMO Training Centre is very much based on a team gains type of debriefing conversation at the end. But have a think about those and see how they fit in. But of course, no matter how well you're prepared, you have to be able to deal with the unexpected challenges that present you. The first 3 listed here, the technology failure, expect the unexpected during a scenario, or dealing with an error that occurred, these all happen during the scenario itself. But obviously, they will feature in the learning conversation. If the technology has failed, isn't it just so classical that, oh yeah, we see, I knew what was going on, but it was the equipment malfunction, so I couldn't possibly have been expected to to recognize that X, Y, or Z was going on with the patient. So have your phrases there. Think about how are you going to acknowledge a technology failure, and make sure that your participants can park that to one side, because it's not about the technology. We accept that something went wrong, but what are we still able to learn from what did transpire? And expect people to come out with the unexpected. I don't think I have ever gone through a single debriefing conversation where I didn't encounter some sort of unexpected comment. And they really, really used to freak me out when I was very inexperienced in simulation. And I would think, how on earth am I supposed to respond to this? Again, go back to those stock phrases that you have written down for yourself, or those key open questions that you have written down for yourself, to give you a way to open the conversation back up to the entire group. You may need to deal with an error that occurred during the scenario. It may not be something that was so significant that it required you to stop the scenario, but you may still have to acknowledge that something didn't go quite the way anybody would have wanted it. So again, think about the language that you use. You've set this up as a place of psychological safety. You've set ground rules. So make sure that if you are highlighting an error and getting it out of the way, that it doesn't interfere with that psychological safety, that it doesn't increase learner anxiety or increase their perception that they may have been a failure. So all about those stock phrases, all about those open questions. The tension pneumothorax in the asthmatic patient is one that is with interns that we used to do this as one of our stock scenarios every year. And it's something that really haunted them. They said, oh, but if that had been for real in the middle of the night, my patient would have died. And we're saying, well, it wasn't for real in the middle of the night. And if this does now happen in the middle of the night, you've been through this in simulation, you've got a new perspective. Do you think you would have a better mechanism for assessing your patient if it did happen in the middle of the night? And let them work through the fact that things have improved because they've made their errors in the simulation. I encourage people to make all the errors they want in a simulation, because then they can work through them and reduce the likelihood of an error in real practice thereafter. And we already touched on this as well. What do you do if you identify serious learner issues? This first cropped up for me as an ACLS medical director when people who needed to have the certification for their jobs simply were not going to pass the course. What do you do? And it may be that you have simulations that do have some sort of summative element to them that do have implications for the workplace, or it may be just that you have come up with some finding that really does expose a huge learning need for an individual. You've created psychological safety in your debriefing conversation. The conversation is about the learning linked to the key learning objectives for everybody. It is not a place to unpick the minute detail and learning needs of individual people who may not have performed to the standard one would expect given their profession and their grade. So don't fall into the trap of going down that rabbit hole with them. Decide how you will deal with it separately and how you will communicate with them while maintaining psychological safety in that subsequent conversation as well. So back to you, I think, Aileen.
Thanks, Niamh. So we're pretty much at the end of this in terms of the debrief and feedback. And I just wanted to mention in terms of the evaluation, because I know we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. I've heard Catherine and Dave talk about this as well. And we're all saying the same thing, that obviously the evaluation strategy has to be aligned to the aims and learning outcomes. Did it actually achieve what it set out to achieve? But I also just wanted to mention things that you will read about, and I would encourage you to read a couple of papers where they've actually evaluated in depth a simulation strategy and get some ideas from those as well. But think about, again, not just what you decide is the learning outcomes for this particular strategy, but how is that actually informed? What was their curriculum? How is it mapped to an entrustable professional activity, if that's the framework, to a graduate outcomes profile, whatever the context is for those learners as well. How will you know that they've actually learned something and achieved those objectives, improve their skills in whatever area it is, and how will you identify and manage further learning needs? And we talked about that. But also then just to make sure that there is some facility to integrate reflection on your all role, and that you all are designing these simulation scenarios. And think about, if you were in the facilitator role, if you were in the simulation lead role, what would be the ways you would like to make those reflections actually contribute to the improvement of the scenario for the next time? And what will you do? How will you record and review the session? If you're going to record it, some simulations you do, some simulations you don't. Again, thinking about the psychological safety involved and all the ethical questions around that as well. Do you need to record it, or actually do you just review it afterwards? And you know, those are conversations that you need to have within your team as well. But do look at the evaluation models on some of those papers that I've referenced as well, and just check and see, can you align some of those as well. So Dr. Feely is going to wrap up here. So I'll say thank you for having me. And it's really been just fascinating to be involved in the competition and to see what's going on. So I can just wish you all the very best with it and the very best of luck. And I'm really excited to see what's going to come out of this as well. So Dr. Feely, I'll let you wrap that up.
Right. Thanks, Aileen. So if we were to pull together everything we've talked about for the past hour, really what we're saying is that right from the very beginning, consider what your debrief strategy is going to be. You may have different debrief strategies for different types of simulations as you progress in your simulation practice. But for this one, for the competition, decide at a very early stage, what's your strategy going to be? Use those 5 questions to help you decide. Remember to carefully align your debrief and evaluation back to those aims and learning objectives that you have set. And make sure that the content does map very well across. If you're evaluating your feedback and debriefing conversations, check whether or not the content and the process of the simulation session as a whole facilitated the development of the skills that you really want your learners to develop. So think about how all the different pieces fit together to facilitate the learner development. And it's not just about learner development. The facilitators need to be trained and supported as well. Consider this, for those of you who are new to simulation, as dipping your toe in the water of faculty training and support for facilitators. But there is a wealth of knowledge out there for you to access. There are videos, there are books, there is a lot of literature about the learning conversations and how to get the most out of simulation and how to use language and context in order to do that. And so make use of all those resources that you find. In addition, what our hope is that as well as being a competition, that this will also help us to start a proper network of simulation faculty members across the Southwest Hospital Group. And the facilitators will hopefully then be able to support each other. And I'm hopeful that this will lead on to bigger and better things for us all. So I look forward to meeting you all in person at some sort of facilitator networking day in the future. And with that, Aileen and I are happy to take any questions that you may have.
I think I counted to 16 there. Emily, we can hear you in slow motion.
Thank you very much.
Emily, we can hear you in slow motion there.
And Dr. Feely. I might have come in a bit too soon.
No, we could just hear you in slow motion there.
Sorry, I think I dropped off there.
Oh, there you are. You're back again.
Thanks very much. I just want to say thanks very much. That I actually think was fantastic, and I think this is just shows how important debriefing is, and I think it's an area that we can carry with us, not just only in the competition, but also into other aspects of teaching as well, such as bedside teaching. I suppose one of the questions we've been getting a lot of is with regards to timing, and I think this workshop here has shown how important it is that, or how debriefing is as important nearly as the simulation itself. And I suppose when people are putting their templates together and the competitions together, there has been some concerns about timing, and now we're not too concerned ourselves with how big or small in terms of timing the simulations and the parts of it are. But would you say that maybe we should set aside almost the same amount of time as we do for the simulation?
Yeah, I think if you're to have a substantial learning conversation, you will need at least the same time. For very many simulations, it's recommended that you give twice as long. So if you even have a 10 to 15 minute simulation, that you would end up having a 20 to 30 minute debriefing conversation afterwards. Now, obviously, if you've only got a couple of people as your learners, you're not going to need 20-30 minutes to go through a conversation with two of them. But if you have a larger group of learners, then obviously you need a little bit more time to make sure that everybody is going to get something out of it. So yeah, I would say at least the same amount of time. And if you have a slightly larger group of learners, you may need more than that again.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions at this time?
From me, a comment. When I design my scenarios, one of the things that I always do is in preparing for the unexpected, I think, okay, if I've got someone who's really, really slow, if I've got someone who's really fast, if I've got someone who goes off on a tangent, and I actually practice, I almost write out little phrases and paragraphs myself to practice how am I going to deal with each of those possibilities, because you do not know what your learners are going to come out with until you're there in the middle of it with them. And they never cease to amaze me. That there's always something I haven't thought of. But cover off as many bases for yourself as possible. You know, try to predict what people might do, what people might say, so that you have something prepared, so that you don't have to do everything on the fly.
That's a really helpful tip, because it's very much learning process to develop this faculty across the network.
Emily, you just disappeared there again.
Okay, I think we might leave it there. So just in the interest of time, but thanks
everyone.
Dr. Feely, and we look forward to meeting you again soon, and maybe a bit.
Take care. Good luck, everyone.
Good luck, folks. Thanks. Bye-bye.